On a quiet morning in the Bay of Quanzhou, the fog moved the way it always had, low and unhurried, drifting across water so still it seemed to hold its breath. The light came slowly, the way autumn light does in that part of the Fujian coast, pale gold seeping through mist that clung to the hills and softened the outline of the shore. Fishermen who worked these waters in later centuries would speak of a stillness here that felt older than the tide itself, a quality in the water that made them lower their voices without quite knowing why. Beneath the surface, hidden in silt that had settled and resettled for generation upon generation, something vast and patient waited. It had no name that anyone living could recall. It had no flag, no crew, no voice. It was simply there, the way a stone is there, the way a memory settles into the floor of a house long after the family has gone. A hull, or what remained of one, timbers laid down by hands that had vanished into history, curved and joined with a precision that spoke of mastery, resting now beneath layers of mud that had, over 700 years, become almost a second sea. To understand what lay beneath that quiet water, one had first to understand what the water itself had once carried. There was a time, long before the fog settled so undisturbed over this bay, when Quanzhou was not silence but symphony. In the centuries of the Song dynasty, when China's southern coast had become the beating commercial heart of an empire that stretched from the mountains of the interior to the furthest edges of the known world, Quanzhou was spoken of by travelers in the same breath as the great cities of Alexandria or Constantinople. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, or so it was later claimed in the annals attributed to his journeys, described a port so vast, so thick with ships, that its harbour resembled a forest grown not of trees but of masts. To stand on the hills above the bay in those years was to look down upon a wooden thicket, hundreds of vessels crowded gunwale to gunwale, their rigging crossing and recrossing against the sky like the branches of some impossible floating grove. Local chroniclers of the era called it Sitong, the city of the flowering trees, for the tung trees whose blossoms once lined its avenues. But foreign sailors arriving from Arabia and Persia and the islands of the southern seas gave it other names, syllables that eventually softened in translation into what history would remember as Zayton, a word that would find its way into the languages of merchants from Cairo to Genoa. This was the gateway. This was the place where the overland Silk Road, with its camel trains and mountain passes, met its oceanic twin, the maritime Silk Road, where the cargo of half the known world was loaded and unloaded upon the same worn stones of the same crowded docks. From Quanzhou, ships departed laden with the fine porcelain of Jingdezhen, packed in straw and rice husks to survive the long voyage south. They carried bolts of silk dyed in colours that would fade to legend by the time they reached their destinations. Dark indigo and imperial crimson, patterns of dragons and clouds woven for buyers who had never seen a Chinese loom. They carried lacquerware, sealed and polished to a shine that seemed almost liquid, and iron tools forged in furnaces whose secrets were closely guarded. In return, the ships that arrived from the west brought fragrant woods, frankincense and sandalwood, brought pepper and cloves and the sharp scent of unfamiliar spices, brought ivory carved by hands an ocean away, brought glass beads and cotton textiles, and, sometimes, stories of places so distant that the merchants who told them seemed almost to be describing another world entirely. The city that grew around this trade was, by necessity, a city of many peoples. Walk through its streets in the years of its greatest prosperity, and one might have passed a mosque built by Arab traders who had settled permanently along the waterfront. Their families now, 3 or 4 generations, removed from the deserts and ports of their ancestors. One might have passed a Hindu temple, its carved stones a curiosity of Tamil merchants who had crossed the Bay of Bengal to make their fortunes here. There were Nestorian Christian communities, descendants of missionaries who had traveled the length of Asia centuries before, and there were Manichaean shrines, relics of a faith that had all but vanished elsewhere in the world but persisted quietly along this stretch of coast. The great Buddhist temples of the city, some of whose pillars and stone carvings still stand today, were themselves often funded by the wealth of sea trade, monks and merchants existing in a kind of quiet symbiosis. Prayers offered for safe voyages in exchange for donations that built ever grander halls. This was a place where a sailor from Hormuz might share a meal with a shipwright from Quanzhou, where a Fujianese merchant's ledger might be written in characters borrowed from 3 different scripts to record the names of business partners scattered across 2 oceans. The government of the Song dynasty, recognizing early the wealth that such trade could bring to the imperial treasury, had established in Quanzhou a maritime trade office, a bureau whose sole purpose was to tax, regulate, and encourage the flow of goods through the port. Officials here inspected cargo, collected duties, and issued the licenses that allowed a merchant vessel to depart legally upon the southern seas. It was a bureaucracy built atop water, an administration whose success was measured not in harvests or land, but in the tonnage of goods that passed beneath its watchful eye. Under its stewardship, the port flourished in a way that few cities anywhere in the medieval world could rival. Some later historians would estimate that in its golden years, Quanzhou's harbour saw more ships pass through its waters annually than any port in Europe. A claim impossible to verify with certainty, but not implausible given the scale of activity described in surviving records, tax registers, and travellers' accounts. And yet, for all its grandeur, for all the wealth stacked in its warehouses, and the incense burning in its temples of a dozen different faiths, Quanzhou's true monument was not built of stone at all. It was built of wood, shaped by hand, launched again and again into water that could just as easily swallow it as carry it safely home. The ships themselves were the city's true achievement, vessels engineered with a sophistication that would not be matched in parts of the Western world for centuries to come. Their hulls were divided by watertight bulkheads, an innovation that meant a single breach need not doom the entire vessel. Their construction employed methods of lamination and joinery so precise that shipwrights elsewhere, encountering wrecks of similar vessels centuries later, would marvel at the craftsmanship, unable at first to fully understand how such strength had been achieved without the benefit of iron nails driven the length of every plank. These were ships built to cross open ocean, to weather the monsoon winds that dictated the sailing seasons, to carry cargo worth more than many a small kingdom's yearly revenue. It was one such ship, or the ghost of one, that lay now beneath the mud of the bay, undiscovered, unremembered by any but the silt that had slowly, patiently buried it away from the light. No record survived to say precisely when she had last sailed, or under what circumstances she had come to rest upon the seabed, rather than in some distant harbour. No manifest remained to list what she had carried in her final hold. No log to record her captain's final entry. No family history passed down to mark her absence. She existed, for 700 years, only as an absence, a gap in the historical record that no one yet knew was there to be filled. The great trading empire that had built her had long since faded. The Song dynasty itself would eventually fall, swept aside by the armies of the Yuan, and though Quanzhou's port would continue for a time under new rulers, the balance of trade and power would shift, slowly, inexorably, toward other harbours, other centuries, other stories. The forest of masts would thin, the foreign quarters would empty, the temples would remain, weathering the centuries in stone long after the wooden ships that funded their construction had rotted, burned, or simply been forgotten. But beneath the water, something remained. A single hull, larger than most that had sailed those medieval seas, lying undisturbed in the mud that had both destroyed and preserved her in equal measure. The very sediment that had crushed her decks and buried her masts had also sealed her away from the air and the worms and the slow decay that claims most wood exposed to open water. In this strange, accidental tomb, she waited, not for rescue, for she was long past any use as a vessel. She waited, if the word can be permitted for a thing without consciousness, for discovery, for the moment when the mud would be disturbed again, when human hands would once more touch timber that had not felt a human touch since the days when Quanzhou's harbour was still filled with the sound of 1,000 ships, and the world she had sailed within was still whole. That moment was still centuries away on this quiet morning in the fog, the water above her hull as undisturbed as it had been for longer than anyone could say. But the story of how she came to rest there, and of how she would one day rise again into the light, is a story worth the telling, slowly in the way that old and patient things deserve. If you would care to stay a while longer, drifting through these lost voyages of centuries past, you might consider lingering here on the channel, where more such stories wait quietly to be told, in their own good time, at their own unhurried pace, much like the sea itself. For now, the fog continued to drift, and the water continued to hold its silence. And somewhere in the mud below, 700 years of history remained exactly where the sea had left it. To understand why a single ship, resting quietly in her bed of grey silt, could carry within her timbers the weight of an entire age, one must first understand the world that built her and the waters she was meant to cross. It was a world stitched together, not by roads or borders, but by currents, by monsoons that arrived with the faithfulness of Scripture, by winds that pushed and pulled entire economies across thousands of miles of open water. In the centuries when Europe still hesitated at the edges of its own coastlines, the waters east of Africa and south of China had already become a vast and living network, one where a merchant in Quanzhou might trade porcelain bound eventually for a household in Cairo, where a physician in Baghdad might grind medicines made from bark harvested in Sumatra, where a length of Chinese silk might pass through a dozen hands and as many tongues before it ever reached the shoulders that would wear it. This was the world of the Song dynasty, an age of extraordinary confidence, extraordinary appetite, and extraordinary reach. And it was this world, patient and expansive, that gave rise to the ship now lying still beneath the mud of Quanzhou Bay. The Song court, unlike some that came before it, looked toward the sea not with suspicion, but with something closer to ambition. Where earlier dynasties had guarded their borders and turned inward, content to receive tribute rather than pursue trade, the Song rulers understood that the sea was not a boundary but a road, one that led outward toward wealth they had not yet imagined and connections they had not yet made. Under their governance, ports along the southern coast were transformed from modest fishing villages into engines of international commerce. Quanzhou itself grew from a regional harbour into one of the great trading cities of the medieval world, a place where the language spoken on the docks might shift from Hokkien to Arabic to Persian to Tamil within the span of a single afternoon, where mosques rose alongside Buddhist temples, where foreign merchants took up long residence and sometimes never left, marrying into local families, raising children who belonged equally to two worlds. The city's harbour filled with vessels of every design, some built along her own shores, others arriving from ports so distant that their construction seemed to belong to an entirely different logic of the sea. It was, by every account left to us, a place humming with a particular kind of energy, the energy of a world that had discovered how much could be gained by trusting the water rather than fearing it. The routes that ships like the one now called the Quanzhou vessel might have sailed formed a great arc across the eastern hemisphere, beginning in the ports of southern China and reaching outward through the waters of the South China Sea, past the ports of what is now Vietnam and the Malay Peninsula, through the narrow channel of the Strait of Malacca, and onward into the vast breathing expanse of the Indian Ocean. From there, the routes fanned further still, north toward the Bay of Bengal and the coasts of India, west toward the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea, and southward along the eastern coast of Africa, where Chinese porcelain has been found buried in the soil of towns whose names rarely appear in the history books familiar to Western readers. This was not a single road, but a web, sustained by traders of many nations who each held their portion of the journey. Arab and Persian merchants, sailing their own dhows with lateen sails that caught the wind in ways distinct from Chinese rigging, often carried goods the final legs into the ports of the Middle East. Southeast Asian intermediaries, based in kingdoms along the Malay coast and the islands of what is now Indonesia, held their own crucial position, offering harbours of rest and resupply, offering their own goods of value, spices grown nowhere else on earth, resins and aromatic woods prized in temples and palaces alike. No single people controlled this vast exchange. It belonged, in a sense, to all of them together, an arrangement of mutual dependence that stretched across cultures separated by thousands of miles, yet bound tightly by shared purpose. To carry cargo across such distances required vessels of a particular kind of ambition, and it was here that Chinese shipbuilders of the Song era distinguished themselves with an ingenuity that would not be matched in other parts of the world for centuries to come. The ships built along the southern coast, in yards not unlike the one that likely produced the vessel now resting in Quanzhou Bay, were constructed according to principles that reflected a deep, almost intuitive understanding of how a hull might survive the punishment of open water. Where many vessels of other traditions relied upon a single continuous hold, vulnerable entirely to a single breach, Chinese shipwrights had developed the practice of dividing a ship's interior into separate watertight compartments, sealed one from another by sturdy bulkheads. Should the sea find its way through the planking in one section, damaging perhaps a portion of the cargo or threatening to flood the vessel entirely, the compartment beside it would remain untouched, sealed and dry, buying the crew time, preserving the ship's ability to remain afloat even in circumstances that might have doomed a lesser design. This innovation, so quietly effective, so unassuming in its genius, would not become standard practice in European shipbuilding until many hundreds of years later, when it was adopted as a matter of safety rather than tradition. The hulls themselves were often built in layers, a technique in which additional planking was affixed atop the primary structure, providing both strength and a degree of resilience against the wear of long voyages, against the slow, abrasive work of barnacles and shipworm, against the simple, accumulated stress of thousands of miles under sail. Where wood alone might weaken over years of service, the layered hull offered a kind of redundancy, a second skin beneath the first, ensuring that damage to the outer layer did not necessarily compromise the vessel's fundamental integrity. Iron nails, forged in quantities that speak to considerable metallurgical infrastructure, held these layers fast, driven through timber with a precision that later excavation would reveal in exacting, almost reverent detail. The ships carried multiple masts, often 3 or more, each bearing sails that could be adjusted independently, allowing a crew to respond to shifting winds with a flexibility unavailable to vessels bound to a single mast and sail. This multiplicity of masts also meant a degree of insurance against catastrophe. Should one mast fail, snapped in a storm or weakened by rot, the ship might still make way under the power of the others, still hold her course, still bring her cargo and crew toward whatever harbour awaited. Below decks, the vessels were built to carry enormous volumes of goods, their holds divided not only for safety, but for the practical sorting of cargo. Different compartments given over to different kinds of merchandise. Porcelain nestled carefully in one section, resins and spices sealed in another. Ballast stones settled low to keep the ship steady against the roll of open water. The scale of these vessels, when compared to many of their counterparts elsewhere in the world during the same period, was considerable. Some historical accounts describe Chinese ships of this era capable of carrying hundreds of people, along with cargo weighing many hundreds of tons, floating fortresses of trade that dwarfed the modest coastal craft still common in much of the Mediterranean and northern Europe at the time. This was shipbuilding not as mere craft, but as a kind of civilizational statement, a demonstration of what could be achieved when generations of accumulated knowledge, metallurgical skill, and maritime ambition were allowed to compound upon each other, refined voyage after voyage, repaired and improved in the same yards where they had first been laid down. And what filled these remarkable hulls speaks just as clearly to the character of the age. Porcelain occupied a place of particular prominence. The pale, translucent wares of southern Chinese kilns, prized across an astonishing range of markets, valued not merely for their beauty, but for a quality of craftsmanship that seemed, to many who encountered it for the first time, to belong almost to magic rather than industry. Silk, woven in patterns that carried within them centuries of accumulated artistic tradition, traveled in bolts destined for the wardrobes of distant elites who had perhaps never seen China themselves, but understood its textiles as a mark of refinement and status. Spices moved in the opposite direction. Pepper and cinnamon and cloves, grown in regions of Southeast Asia and beyond, carried northward and westward to season the tables and preserve the meats of households thousands of miles from where the plants themselves had grown. Medicines traveled too. Herbal compounds and mineral preparations exchanged between traditions of healing that, though distinct, found in maritime trade a means of borrowing from one another. Physicians in one port learning of remedies practiced in another. Ingredients once local to a single region gradually becoming available, at a price, to those willing to pay for them across the sea. But it was not only objects that moved along these routes. Ideas traveled in the same holds, carried in the minds of the merchants, sailors, and religious travelers who made these journeys, sometimes returning home after years abroad, sometimes settling permanently in foreign ports, founding communities that endured for generations. Buddhist monks made pilgrimages by sea as readily as by land, carrying texts and teachings between India and China. Islamic scholars and traders established communities in Chinese port cities that would persist for centuries, leaving behind mosques and gravestones inscribed in Arabic that archaeologists would later uncover among the more expected relics of Chinese material culture. Astronomical knowledge, navigational techniques, even culinary practices drifted along these same routes, absorbed and adapted by each culture that encountered them, until the very notion of a purely isolated tradition, untouched by outside influence, became almost impossible to sustain in any of the great port cities that lined this vast trading world. It was a world, in short, of quiet grandeur, sustained not by conquest, but by exchange, not by empire in the traditional sense, but by the patient accumulation of countless individual voyages, each one a small act of faith in the sea and in the strangers waiting at its far shores. The ship that would one day be raised from the mud of Quanzhou Bay was, in her own time, simply one vessel among a great many, one hull among a fleet whose full number no record now preserves. Setting out with purpose not yet named by history, carrying cargo whose final destination we can only partially reconstruct, crewed by men whose names have mostly been lost to time. She was not extraordinary in her own age. She was, rather, entirely ordinary, a working ship built to a proven design, doing what thousands of ships like her did every season, riding the monsoon winds outward and waiting for their return, trusting in bulkheads and iron nails and the accumulated wisdom of generations of shipwrights to carry her safely across water that held no guarantees. It is only from the distance of centuries, only from the vantage of a world that has forgotten how ordinary such voyages once were. That her survival, however partial, however silent, begins to feel like something closer to a miracle. Consider, then, what she must have looked like in the fullness of her working life before the sea closed over her and the mud began its long, patient work of preservation. She would have measured somewhere near 34 meters from bow to stern, broad enough in the beam to seem almost squat beside the slender warships of later centuries. But that breadth was not a flaw. It was her purpose made visible. A ship built for cargo does not need to cut the water like a blade. She needs to hold it, to carry within her hull the accumulated weight of a season's trading, and every line of her construction bent toward that single patient ambition. Her planking, when divers and archaeologists would one day trace its remains, revealed itself to be a marriage of two timbers, pine for the lighter upper strakes, fir for the sterner work below the waterline, each chosen not by accident, but by a knowledge so old it had ceased to feel like knowledge at all, and had become instead a kind of inherited instinct, passed from a shipwright's hands to his son's hands without ever quite needing to be spoken aloud. The pine gave her lightness where lightness mattered, and the fir gave her strength where the sea would press hardest, and together they formed a hull that could flex without breaking, that could absorb the long, slow violence of the waves rather than resist it outright, for resistance, the old builders understood, was the surest way to die at sea. Better to bend, better to yield a little, and live. And within that hull, hidden from any eye that did not know to look for them, lay the feature that would one day make this ship, more than any other relic of her age, a subject of quiet wonder among those who study the sea. She was divided along her length by a series of solid bulkheads, 12 of them, perhaps 13, depending on how one counts the partial divisions near her bow, each one rising from keel to deck like a rib of timber standing sentinel against catastrophe. These bulkheads were not merely structural. They were, in their way, an act of foresight so advanced that Europe would not adopt anything resembling them for another 500 years, and even then only slowly, only reluctantly, as shipbuilders elsewhere gradually came to understand what Chinese craftsmen along the Fujian coast had already known for generations: that a ship divided into sealed compartments could suffer a wound below the waterline, could take on water through a breach in a single chamber, and still survive, still float, still carry her crew home, because the flooding would be contained, held within its walls, unable to spread to the compartments on either side. It was not invincibility. No ship built by human hands was ever that. But it was insurance of a kind that the sea rarely granted, a hedge against the thousand small disasters that a long voyage inevitably invited, and it speaks to something almost tender in the character of those who built her, an unwillingness to leave survival entirely to fortune, a determination to build safety into the very bones of the vessel wherever human skill allowed. The men who raised her, whoever they were, have left us no names, no portraits, no proud inscriptions carved into her timbers to declare their authorship. They belonged to a tradition of craft so thoroughly woven into the fabric of Fujian's coastal life that individual recognition would scarcely have occurred to them as a thing worth seeking. Shipbuilding along that stretch of coast was not a trade one simply entered. It was a lineage one was born into, or married into, or apprenticed into as a boy and never quite left, even in old age, even when the hands grew too stiff to swing an adze with the old precision, and the younger men had to be trusted with the delicate work of fitting a strake to a curve that existed, at first, only in the master's memory. There were no blueprints in the way a later age would understand them, no diagrams committed permanently to paper and consulted like scripture. There was instead a body of knowledge carried in gesture and habit, in the particular way a master shipwright might run his palm along a length of timber to feel for a grain that would split under strain, in the songs sailors and builders sang while they worked that encoded, without either party quite realizing it, rules of proportion and ratio refined across centuries of trial. And where practical knowledge reached its limits, where the builders could not yet explain why a certain joint held and another failed, superstition filled the gap, not as a rejection of craft but as its natural companion. A vessel might be blessed before her keel was laid. Certain days were deemed inauspicious for cutting timber, certain winds unlucky for raising a mast. None of this seemed, to the men who practiced it, in any way separate from the practical business of building a sound ship. The sea was not merely a physical force to be calculated, it was also a power to be respected, propitiated, spoken to gently before one asked it to carry a fortune in silk and porcelain across 1,000 miles of open water. It is harder still to speak with any certainty of the men who would have sailed her, for the sea has kept them more thoroughly hidden than it kept her timbers. Yet the shape of their world can be reconstructed from the wider patterns of the age, from the manifests and travelers' accounts and scattered records that survive from ports up and down the coast, and from these fragments a plausible company begins to take form. There would have been a captain, certainly, a man of considerable experience, for no owner would have entrusted a vessel of this size and value to inexperienced hands, and Quanzhou in this era did not lack for such men, sailors who had made the passage to Sumatra or to the ports of the Malabar coast so many times that the route had worn itself into a kind of second nature, who could read the coming of the monsoon in the color of the evening sky as easily as a farmer reads the season in the color of the leaves. Beneath him would have served a hierarchy of officers responsible for the countless practical demands of a long voyage. Men who understood the rigging, men who understood the loading and balance of cargo, men whose task it was to keep the ship's stores of food and fresh water sufficient for a passage that might stretch across many weeks with no certainty of resupply. And beyond the officers, a larger body of ordinary sailors, drawn very likely from the fishing villages that lined the Fujian coast, men for whom the sea had never been an abstraction but the only trade their families had ever known, men who could climb rigging in a gale with the same unthinking confidence that a farmer's son might show climbing a familiar tree. But this ship, bound as she likely was for ports where languages shifted as often as the coastline itself, would have needed more than sailors alone. She would have carried merchants, men whose fortunes rode as literally as their bodies did upon her decks, who had invested in the goods stowed below and who traveled with them to oversee their sale, to haggle in foreign ports over prices, to guard against the countless small dishonesties that could erode a profit margin across a voyage of many months. Some of these merchants may have been Chinese, extending their trading networks outward into the wider world. Others, given the deeply cosmopolitan nature of Quanzhou's maritime commerce, may have been Arab or Persian traders long settled in the city, men whose families had lived along that coast for generations and who moved as comfortably between Chinese customs and the customs of the Indian Ocean world as they moved between languages. And where trade required communication, there would have been interpreters as well, men whose value lay not in strength or seamanship, but in the rarer skill of translating not merely words but intentions, of navigating the delicate diplomacy of a transaction between strangers who shared no common tongue but a mutual desire to profit from the exchange. It is entirely possible, even likely, that the ship's short, final voyage carried men whose homes lay not in China at all, but in Sumatra, in the ports of the Malay world, in communities where Chinese trading vessels were so familiar a sight that certain families had, over generations, come to think of themselves as belonging equally to two shores. And what did they load into her hold? These men whose names have vanished but whose hopes, in some quiet sense, still cling to the fragments of timber and cargo that survived them. The loading of a ship like this one was itself a kind of ceremony, though a practical one, for every basket and jar and bundle had to be placed with care, the heaviest goods low and centered to keep her steady in a following sea, the more perishable cargo positioned where air might reach it, the whole arrangement a puzzle solved through experience rather than calculation. Into her would have gone the accumulated wealth of southern China's workshops and kilns, bolts of silk woven in patterns meant for foreign eyes, stacks of porcelain nested in straw to survive the ship's constant motion, lacquerware boxed carefully against moisture, medicines and spices whose value lay as much in their rarity as their usefulness. Each item represented not merely goods, but a chain of labor and hope stretching backward into workshops and farms across the interior of China, and forward into markets the loaders themselves would never see, into the hands of buyers whose faces they could only imagine. There is something quietly moving in this thought. that a vessel so anonymous to history once carried within her hold the concentrated ambitions of hundreds of people who never once set foot upon her deck, weavers and potters and farmers whose fortunes rode outward on a ship they had never seen, entrusted entirely to men they had never met, borne across a sea whose moods they could only imagine from the safety of the shore. She left on a morning when the tide stood high and the wind came steady from the north, the kind of morning that harbour pilots watched for through the last weeks of the sailing season, when the monsoon had settled into its long southward breath and would not soon change its mind. The lines were cast from the stone bollards, wet with the night's dew, and for a moment the ship seemed to hesitate, as vessels often do at the instant of parting, caught between the stillness of the harbour and the restlessness of the open water beyond the breakwater. Then the current took her, gentle at first, and the oarsmen in the small boats that had towed her clear of the anchorage bent to their work, and the gap between her hull and the quay began to widen in a way that could not be undone. The sails rose in their turn, batten by batten, the bamboo ribs unfolding like the wing of some enormous bird that had folded itself small to pass through a narrow door, and now, in open water, remembered its true size. There would have been a particular sound to this, a dry, rattling hush as the canvas or woven matting caught the air, followed by the deeper groan of the mast stepping into its full labour, the whole ship shivering very slightly as it took the wind's weight onto itself. Sailors of that age spoke of a vessel coming alive in this moment, of the difference between a hull merely floating and a hull sailing, and whatever her name had been, this ship would have felt that change pass through her timbers as clearly as a man feels his own breath deepen when he begins to run. Quanzhou fell away slowly behind them, as harbours always do, reluctant to release what they have built. The white walls of the city's temples caught the early sun a while longer than the lower buildings around them, and the twin pagodas that rose above the old town remained visible longer still, thin grey fingers against a paling sky, landmarks that generations of sailors had used to fix their position on the final approach home. For those aboard who had made this passage before, the sight of the pagodas sinking beneath the horizon was a small, private ritual, a farewell repeated so many times it had become almost unremarkable, and yet never entirely so, for no sailor of that century could be certain which farewell might prove to be his last. The coastline itself lingered longest of all, a grey-green smudge low in the water, hills and river mouths and fishing villages blurring together until they were indistinguishable from the haze, and then, at some moment, no one could name precisely. They were simply gone, and there was only sea. The route she would follow was not a line drawn once and repeated blindly, but a living pattern, refined across centuries by pilots who had learned to read the ocean as a farmer reads the sky. From Quanzhou, the ship would have borne south and somewhat east, keeping the coast of Fujian and then Guangdong at a comfortable distance, close enough to take bearings from known headlands when the weather allowed, far enough to avoid the shoals and reefs that had claimed so many careless vessels before her. She would have passed, in the imagined unfolding of this voyage, within sight of Hainan's northern shore, then out into the wider bowl of the South China Sea, where the true test of the monsoon began. This was the season when the wind blew reliably from the northeast, filling the sails day after day with a patience no oarsman could match, driving ships like this one toward the ports that clustered along the coasts of what sailors then called Champa and Zhenla, toward the narrow straits that led further still into the waters near Palembang and beyond, where the Spice Islands lay scattered like scattered coins across a floor of blue. The monsoon was not merely wind, but calendar, dictating when a ship might safely leave and when it must return, shaping the entire rhythm of trade along this corridor in a way that no human authority could override. To sail against it was to invite delay, exhaustion, and worse. To sail with it was to be carried, almost gently, toward fortune. Life aboard settled quickly into its own order, the disorder of departure giving way within a day or two to the steady rhythm that would govern the weeks ahead. The crew divided themselves into watches, some sleeping in the cramped quarters below while others tended the sails, the tiller, the endless small repairs that any wooden vessel demanded of those who lived upon her. Meals were simple and repeated with the reliability of ritual. Rice cooked in great iron pots lashed against the ship's roll, dried fish soaked back to some semblance of tenderness, vegetables pickled before departure to survive the weeks at sea, jars of preserved bean paste dipped into sparingly to season what would otherwise have been very plain fare. Fresh water was measured with the same care as the cargo, poured from great ceramic jars into smaller vessels for daily use. Its level watched as closely as any merchant watched his ledgers, for a ship that ran short of water in open sea had no recourse but the mercy of the sky. The air below decks would have carried its own particular scent, one that anyone who has spent time aboard old wooden vessels would recognize at once. The sharp sweetness of pine resin used to seal the seams, mingling with salt and damp timber and the particular must of goods packed close together in the dark, porcelain wrapped in straw, spices sealed in jars, the faint mineral tang of iron implements stored against rust. Above decks, the smell changed with the weather, salt spray giving way to the smoky char of the cooking fire. Then to nothing at all when a strong wind scoured the deck clean, leaving only the clean mineral smell of open ocean, a smell sailors of every era have described in nearly identical words across centuries and languages, as though the sea has only ever had one true scent to offer those who venture onto it. There would have been prayers, too, offered with the same regularity as meals, for a voyage such as this was never undertaken without the favor of the gods who ruled the waters. Before departure, incense would have been burned before a small shrine to Mazu, the goddess whose worship had spread along this coast precisely because sailors needed somewhere to place their fear when the wind turned foul and the horizon offered no comfort. Aboard ship, a small altar likely occupied some sheltered corner, tended by whichever crew member had been charged with its care, replenished with fresh offerings when the weather allowed, consulted with particular fervor when clouds gathered in shapes the older sailors did not like. This was not empty ritual to those who practiced it. It was a form of navigation as real, in its way, as reading the stars, a means of orienting oneself not merely in space, but in the vast uncertainty of fate, a way of saying quietly and repeatedly that human skill alone could not be trusted to carry a ship safely across such distances, that something more was needed, and that the something more deserved to be asked politely and often. The ship herself spoke constantly in the language particular to wooden vessels under sail, the creak and groan of timber flexing against the sea's endless pressure, a sound that new sailors found unsettling and old sailors found reassuring. For a silent ship was a ship that had stopped moving, and a ship that had stopped moving in open water was a ship in trouble. The rigging hummed in steady winds and slapped and complained in fitful ones. The hull itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the temperature of sun and spray, working gently at the corked seams that kept the sea on its proper side of the planking. Experienced hands could tell a great deal from these sounds alone, could sense when a joint was working loose, when a plank had begun to weep more than it should, when the ordinary complaints of a hard-working vessel shaded into something that required attention. And it was in these small accumulating signs that the seeds of later trouble first appeared, though no single one of them would have seemed alarming on its own. The ship rode low in the water, her holds packed to a fullness that spoke well of her owner's ambitions and less well of her margin for error in heavy weather. Months of continuous trade had left her timbers worked by long exposure to sun, salt, and the particular fatigue that comes from repeated flexing under sail, wear invisible to the eye but present nonetheless in the fibers of the wood, in the slight loosening of joints once cut and fitted with perfect precision. The monsoon, so reliable in its general pattern, was never perfectly predictable in its particulars, and sailors of the region had long learned to watch for certain signs: a peculiar heaviness in the air, a ring around the moon, birds flying inland with unusual urgency that suggested the season's temper might shift sooner or more violently than the calendar alone would indicate. None of this constituted a warning precisely. It was simply the ordinary condition of a heavily laden ship far from home in a sea whose moods, however patterned, remained ultimately beyond any sailor's full command. The crew would have noted these things the way sailors always note them, with a kind of watchful acceptance rather than alarm, filing them away as considerations for the pilot's judgment rather than causes for immediate concern. The wind continued to fill her sails. The coast of home continued to recede, and somewhere ahead, though no one aboard could yet have named it, the sea was already beginning to gather the conditions that would, in time, decide this voyage's final chapter, patiently, indifferently, the way the sea has always gathered such things, long before those it concerns have any cause to imagine the shape of what is coming. Below decks, in the long dim hold that ran nearly the length of her keel, the ship carried a world that no single culture could have assembled alone. To walk that space, had anyone been permitted to walk it freely, would have been to move through a catalogue of the era's desires, stacked and lashed and wrapped against the damp, each item a small argument for why men would risk their lives upon the water at all. Aromatic wood filled much of that darkness. Sandalwood, pale and dense, carried a fragrance that would only fully release itself months later in incense burners far from the sea that had carried it. Frankincense and myrrh, resins hardened into small amber-colored tears, had travelled already once before reaching this hold, brought by other ships from the coasts of Arabia and the Horn of Africa to ports in southern India, where Chinese vessels gathered them alongside goods from a dozen other origins. Such resins burned in temples the ship's own crew would never see, rose as smoke before altars in cities whose names they might never learn, and carried with that smoke a value entirely disproportionate to their weight. A handful of resin, carefully stored, was worth more than many times its measure in rice. This was cargo chosen not for bulk, but for concentration, wealth compressed into small, fragrant parcels that a single sailor could carry in two hands and that would, upon arrival, fetch prices sufficient to fund a household for a season. Spices travelled beside them, though less romantically remembered than their reputation might suggest. Pepper, black and wrinkled, filled sacks in quantities that spoke less of luxury than of steady demand, for pepper by this era had become something closer to a currency than a delicacy, used to season food across a startling range of cuisines and valued precisely because its use was so widespread. Cinnamon bark, rolled into tight quills, added its own note to the hold's mingled scent. Cloves, harvested from trees that grew at this point in history, almost nowhere but a small cluster of islands far to the south, represented a supply chain of remarkable length. Grown on volcanic soil, few of the ship's crew could have located on any chart, gathered by hands whose language they did not speak, traded through intermediary ports before ever reaching a vessel bound northward, and destined ultimately for kitchens and apothecaries in cities whose names those Indonesian growers would never hear in return. The clove did not care whose hands carried it. It simply moved, generation after generation, along paths that human ambition had worn into the water, the way rivers wear their courses into stone. Medicinal substances occupied their own careful section of the hold, wrapped and labelled with a precision that spoke to their value and their danger in equal measure. Camphor, valued both as medicine and as a component in various preparations, required careful storage away from open flame. Certain roots and dried barks, whose uses ranged from treating fever to easing childbirth to more specialized applications whose exact nature has not survived in any surviving record, traveled in smaller quantities, tended by someone aboard who understood their properties and their risks. Medicine, in this era as in most others, moved along the same routes as luxury and spice, for the line between a substance that healed and a substance that merely pleased was rarely as clean as later centuries would prefer to imagine. A merchant investing in medicinal cargo was investing in effect in human vulnerability itself, in the certainty that illness would continue to visit ports regardless of season or circumstance, and that those willing to bring relief, however imperfect, would always find buyers. Then there was the ceramic, that most fragile and most enduring of Chinese exports, packed with an ingenuity that modern archaeologists would later find almost startling in its practicality. Bowls nested within bowls, each cushioned by the one beneath it, straw and rice husks packed into every gap where the material could be spared. Some vessels were even filled with smaller items, so that space itself became cargo, every cubic inch pressed into service. The ceramics ranged in quality from the workaday to the refined, ordinary glazed wares destined for ordinary households sharing hold space with finer pieces bound for wealthier tables, temples, or the collections of foreign rulers who had developed by this era a considerable appetite for Chinese porcelain's particular blue and white brilliance, its durability, its association with a civilization whose products had come to signify sophistication far beyond the borders where they were made. A single crate of porcelain, properly packed and safely delivered, might represent months of a craftsman's labor multiplied across dozens of pieces, each one destined for a life entirely separate from the kiln that had produced it, entirely separate from the ship that now carried it, entirely separate, too, from the country whose name it would forever after be associated with in the minds of those who purchased it thousands of miles from where it was made. And beneath all of this, in strong boxes whose exact contents can only be inferred from later evidence, coins traveled as both cargo and currency, both goods to be sold, and the very medium through which other goods would be purchased at each stop along the route. Copper coins, strung on cords through the square holes at their centers, formed heavy coils that required careful stowage against the ship's constant motion. These coins carried Chinese characters into ports where they might be used directly, melted down for their metal, or simply admired as evidence of the empire's reach, for Chinese currency by this period had become something of an informal standard across portions of maritime Asia, accepted in transactions far beyond the borders of the state that minted it. To carry coin was to carry not merely wealth but a kind of portable sovereignty, a physical assertion that the empire whose face appeared on each disc extended its influence, however lightly, into every port where its money changed hands. Consider, then, what a single hull like this one actually represented, once all these elements are held together in the mind at once. This was not simply a ship carrying goods from one nation to another in some simple bilateral exchange. This was a vessel knitting together an entire hemisphere's worth of separate economies, separate labor, separate ambitions into a single temporary unity that existed only for the duration of the voyage and would dissolve again, upon arrival, into 100 separate transactions scattered across 100 separate destinations. The sandalwood had grown in forests tended by communities whose names history has mostly forgotten. The pepper had been harvested by hands accustomed to a climate the ship's crew had never felt. The porcelain had been shaped by craftsmen in kilns whose particular techniques had taken generations to perfect, techniques passed from master to apprentice in workshops far from any coast. The coins bore the mark of an imperial mint that answered to authorities who would never see this particular ship, never know this particular voyage, and yet whose economic decisions, made in distant capitals, shaped every transaction this vessel would ultimately complete. A single wooden frame, riding low in the water under the accumulated weight of all this exchange, thus became something larger than a ship. It became a kind of moving marketplace, a temporary meeting point for economies that would otherwise have had no direct contact at all, its hold a physical manifestation of connections that existed nowhere else in such concentrated form. To lose such a vessel was not merely to lose timber and rigging and the lives of those aboard, terrible as that loss alone would be. It was to sever, all at once, dozens of threads that had taken years, sometimes generations, to weave into their current configuration. It was to erase, in a single afternoon of storm or misjudgment, an entire season's worth of careful accumulation, careful negotiation, careful trust extended across cultures and languages and vast distances of open water. And behind every category of cargo, behind every carefully packed crate and coiled string of coin, stood human beings whose futures rode upon this ship's safe arrival with an intimacy that the cargo manifests themselves could never fully record. Merchants in Quanzhou who had invested their capital, sometimes their families' entire accumulated wealth, into this single voyage, now waited through the months of the ship's absence with whatever patience they could manage, aware that a lost vessel meant not merely disappointed profit but genuine ruin, debts that could not be repaid, households that would need to be sold, children whose prospects would narrow considerably before they had even reached an age to understand why. Families of the sailors themselves waited with a different, more immediate kind of concern, one measured not in coin, but in the simple hope of a husband's or a son's or a father's return, a hope that had no ledger, no accounting, no way to be recovered if it proved, in time, to have been misplaced. And somewhere at the voyage's eventual destination, foreign traders in ports the ship had not yet reached were themselves waiting, calculating arrival dates against seasonal winds, preparing warehouse space, arranging the local goods they intended to offer in exchange, extending a kind of trust across the water that this vessel, sailing toward them from a country most of them would never visit, would indeed arrive as expected, would indeed carry what it was rumored to carry, would indeed complete its half of an exchange that both sides had committed to based on nothing more than reputation, precedent, and the accumulated evidence of ships that had made this same crossing safely before. All of this, every hope and every calculation, rode upon a single wooden hull, perhaps 34 meters in length, its planks joined by hands whose names have not survived, its seams caulked against a sea that made no promises to anyone. The weight of expectation pressing down upon that frame was, in its own way, heavier than any cargo listed on a manifest, for it could not be jettisoned in a storm, could not be lightened by throwing goods overboard, could not be insured against in any meaningful sense beyond the vague comfort of precedent and prayer. Every ship that made this crossing carried, alongside its aromatic woods and its careful ceramics and its coiled strings of coin, an invisible burden of accumulated trust that grew heavier with every voyage successfully completed, and that would, should this particular voyage fail to complete itself, come crashing down all at once upon everyone who had extended it, in ports on both sides of a sea that continued all the while to keep its own counsel, indifferent to the fortunes it held suspended above its depths. There is no record of the exact day the weather turned, and this absence is itself a kind of testimony to how unremarkable the beginning of the end must have seemed to those aboard. The sea does not announce its intentions with fanfare. It offers instead a series of small alterations, each one dismissible on its own, each one folding into the next until the accumulation becomes undeniable and by then, often, irreversible. A shift in the color of the water, perhaps, from the deep jade common to those southern approaches to a grayer, more agitated hue. A change in the wind that a lesser sailor might not have noticed, but that men who had spent decades reading the sky would have registered in their bones before their minds fully articulated the thought. The barometric pressure of the era existed only in the sensations of the body, an ache in old wounds, a peculiar heaviness in the air that made breathing feel like drawing water through cloth, a stillness that preceded motion the way a held breath precedes a shout. The ship was returning, by most reconstructions, from one of her voyages along the southern trading routes, her hold weighted with the accumulated cargo of ports visited and negotiations concluded, her crew perhaps allowing themselves the particular species of relief that comes near the end of a long passage, when the destination has transformed from an abstraction into something almost within reach. Quanzhou Bay, with its familiar headlands and its scattered fishing vessels and its harbour lights that could be seen on clear nights from a considerable distance out at sea, would have represented not merely a geographic point but an emotional one, the boundary between the uncertainty of open water and the relative safety of home waters, however illusory that safety might prove to be. It is worth pausing here to consider what safety meant to sailors of this era, men who understood perhaps more intimately than any other class of human beings before the modern age the thinness of the membrane separating survival from catastrophe. They had crossed vast distances of water that offered no purchase, no solid ground, nothing but the ship itself between them and depths that no sounding line of their time could measure. They had watched storms consume the horizon and had made their private accommodations with the possibility of death in ways that those who never left dry land could scarcely comprehend. And yet the approach to home harbour, however illusory its comforts, produced in sailors across cultures and centuries a kind of premature relaxation, a loosening of the vigilance that had sustained them through more obviously dangerous waters. This psychological pattern, the tendency for disaster to strike not in the midst of acknowledged peril, but in the moments when peril seemed to be receding, repeats itself throughout maritime history with a consistency that borders on the uncanny, and there is no particular reason to imagine the Quanzhou ship as an exception to this pattern. What we know, or believe we know, from the marine archaeological reconstruction that would occur many centuries later, suggest a vessel that succumbed not to a single catastrophic event, but to a confluence of circumstances that individually might have been survivable. The excavated remains show evidence of what researchers would eventually interpret as storm damage, splintering along certain structural members, patterns of stress that align with the kind of violent lateral forces a ship experiences when waves strike it broadside rather than bow on. This suggests a vessel caught perhaps by a shift in wind direction that came too suddenly for the helmsman to correct, or a captain who made the judgment reasonable enough in the moment to maintain a heading that would prove less forgiving than an alternative course might have been. Imagine then the sequence as it might have unfolded, not with the certainty of eyewitness account, but with the informed plausibility of those who have studied enough shipwrecks to understand the grammar of maritime disaster. The wind rising first, an increase so gradual that the adjustments made to the rigging felt routine rather than urgent. Another reef taken in the sail, lines checked and retentioned. The ordinary vigilance of experienced sailors responding to ordinary changes in condition. Then the rain, arriving perhaps as a curtain visible first at a distance, sweeping across the water's surface in a manner that the crew would have recognized immediately for what it was, though recognition and preparation are not the same thing when the sea has already begun to organize itself into swells too large for comfort. The ship herself, sturdy as she was, built with the accumulated wisdom of generations of Quanzhou shipwrights, would have responded to the building sea in the language particular to wooden vessels under stress, a language of sound as much as motion. The timbers groan, not metaphorically but literally, wood fibre compressing and releasing under loads it was engineered to bear, but perhaps not engineered to bear indefinitely, or not engineered to bear in combination with whatever additional stresses the voyage itself had already imposed upon a hull that had made this crossing or others like it, more times than anyone aboard could likely enumerate. The multiple bulkheads that made this vessel so distinctively resilient, the same watertight compartments that would later fascinate the archaeologists who studied her remains, performed exactly the function for which they had been designed, containing whatever water breached the hull to isolated sections rather than allowing it to flood the vessel wholesale. This is, in its own way, a kind of mercy, though it is a mercy that operates on the scale of hours rather than the scale of rescue, a mercy that ensures a slow settling rather than a sudden and violent foundering, that gives a crew time to understand what is happening to them without necessarily giving them the means to prevent it. Water finds its way into a stressed wooden hull through means too numerous to catalogue and too intimate to fully reconstruct at this distance in time. A seam that has worked loose under the repeated flexing of the hull in heavy seas. A plank sprung by the impact of a wave that arrived at an angle the ship's design had not fully anticipated. The accumulated wear of a working vessel, patched and repaired across seasons of hard use, finally exceeding what those patches and repairs could accommodate. Whatever the specific mechanism, the water would have entered gradually rather than catastrophically, filling the lower reaches of the hold, rising past the ballast, reaching upward toward the cargo that the ship carried with such careful stowage, the ceramics nested in their protective packing, the aromatic woods, the coined currency that had represented to someone an investment of considerable hope. The crew's response to this rising water would have followed the established rhythms of maritime crisis management, rhythms that existed in this era not as written protocol, but as inherited practice, passed from experienced sailors to their juniors through the simple mechanism of demonstration and correction across countless prior voyages. Pumps, if the vessel carried them in a form recognizable to us, would have been worked continuously, the physical labor of bailing performed by hands already calloused from the ordinary demands of a working ship. Cargo might have been shifted, or in more desperate circumstances, jettisoned, though the archaeological record, with its abundant surviving cargo, suggests that whatever crisis unfolded did not proceed to the point of wholesale abandonment of the ship's commercial burden, a detail that itself tells us something about the pace and character of the disaster. This was not a sinking accomplished in minutes, with sailors flinging their cargo into the sea in desperate bids to keep the vessel afloat. This was something slower, something that perhaps did not fully announce itself as fatal until fatality had already become unavoidable. There is a particular quality to a ship's final hours that distinguishes it from swifter maritime disasters, a quality of extended negotiation between vessel and sea in which neither party fully yields until the very end. The Quanzhou ship, if the archaeological evidence permits such inference, seems to have experienced something of this character, a battle not lost in a single dramatic reversal, but conceded gradually, compartment by compartment, as the multiple bulkheads that had served her so well for so long were breached one after another by water that found, eventually, every avenue available to it. The ship would have settled lower in the water with each passing hour, her freeboard diminishing, her responsiveness to the helm growing sluggish in the particular way that tells experienced sailors more clearly than any instrument could that the balance between buoyancy and gravity has shifted decisively against them. And still, throughout this slow surrender, the sea itself would have continued in its indifferent rhythms, the same waves that were consuming the ship rolling onward toward shores where fishermen and merchants and families with relatives aboard trading vessels went about their ordinary business, unaware that anything unusual was occurring beyond the horizon's edge. This is perhaps the aspect of maritime disaster hardest for those who have never experienced open water to fully absorb the way catastrophe unfolds in near-total isolation, witnessed by no one beyond its immediate participants, the vast ocean absorbing the event into its general indifference without any external acknowledgement that something significant has occurred. No bell rang on shore. No watcher on a headland saw the ship go down. Whatever happened, happened privately, in the particular privacy that only deep water can provide, a privacy that would persist, undisturbed, for the better part of 7 centuries. The ship's final descent, when it came, would not have possessed the violence that later ages, accustomed to their own catastrophic maritime disasters, might imagine. There would have been no explosive implosion, no dramatic final plunge witnessed by horrified onlookers. There would only have been the water rising past the point where the ship's remaining buoyancy could resist it, the vessel settling by degrees into the bay's relatively shallow waters near its mouth, her structure remaining largely intact even as she came finally to rest upon the seabed, her cargo still nested in its careful stowage, her timbers already beginning the long, patient negotiation with mud and silt, and time that would eventually preserve her, however altered, for discovery by generations not yet conceived. The sea closed over her without ceremony. The mud received her without comment, and the world above the water's surface continued turning, entirely unaware that somewhere beneath Quanzhou Bay, a vessel that had carried the accumulated hopes of merchants and sailors across the breadth of the maritime Silk Road had simply, quietly stopped. Above the water, the centuries did what centuries do. They moved forward without pause, indifferent to the small silence that had settled into the bay's soft floor. The dynasty that had watched the ship depart, whose officials had stamped her manifests, and whose merchants had entrusted her hold with the accumulated wealth of their ambitions, would itself pass into memory before the mud had finished its slow work upon her timbers. Empires are not so different from ships in this respect. They are built with confidence, launched with ceremony, and eventually surrendered to forces larger than themselves. The dynasty gave way to another, and that one in time to another still, each transition marked above the water by battles and coronations, and the burning of old records to make way for new decrees, while below the water nothing of the sort occurred. There were no ceremonies in the mud. There was only the ship, settling by degrees into a stillness so complete that it began to resemble permanence. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of that submerged interval, to consider what 700 years actually means when measured not in the turning of pages, but in the settling of silt. A human life, even a long one, passes in what geological time would consider an instant. A dynasty, however grand its monuments, occupies perhaps 3 or 4 centuries before its palaces crumble and its officials are remembered only in the footnotes of later historians, if they are remembered at all. But 7 centuries beneath the water is a different kind of duration altogether, one that does not announce itself in anniversaries or commemorations, because there was no one present to count the years. The ship did not know she had been resting for a decade, or a century, or 5. She simply continued the process she had begun on the day the water first closed over her deck, which was the process of becoming something other than a ship. She was becoming, instead, a record, a sealed and patient archive that would not be catalogued for longer than most nations managed to endure. The transformation unfolded with the particular slowness that only underwater processes seem to possess, unhurried by weather or season, uninterrupted by the passage of storms above, since even the fiercest typhoon that lashed the surface of the bay would send only the faintest disturbance down into the settled dark where the ship lay. In the earliest years, the currents that moved through Quanzhou Bay carried with them the fine particulate matter that rivers deposit into estuaries the world over. Silt washed down from inland hills, sand stirred by tidal action, the countless small fragments of organic matter that drift and settle wherever water slows enough to release its burden. This sediment did not fall upon the wreck all at once in some dramatic burial, but arrived instead in the manner of all patient things, a grain at a time, a season at a time, building in thin strata that would one day allow those who excavated the site to read the bay's own history in layers, much as one might read the rings of a very old tree. The wood of the ship, meanwhile, underwent its own transformation, one governed by chemistry as much as by time. Submerged wood does not decay in the way that wood exposed to open air decays, through the dry rot and insect boring and fungal growth that reduce a fallen tree to soil within a few short years. Underwater, particularly in the low oxygen conditions that develop once sediment has sealed a wreck away from the currents above, decay slows to a crawl and sometimes very nearly stops altogether. The wood does not vanish. It darkens. It absorbs, over the passing decades, the minerals suspended in the water and mud around it, until the very cellular structure of the timber becomes saturated with substances the tree that produced it could never have anticipated. The pale, freshly cut planking that shipwrights had once shaped with careful adzes grew steadily darker, taking on the deep brown and black tones that seem, to those who encounter such wood centuries later, almost like the color of the earth itself, as though the ship were being slowly reclaimed into the substance from which, in some sense, all wood ultimately comes. The cargo, too, settled into its long dormancy. The ceramics that had been so carefully nested in straw and packed into the vessel's compartmented hold did not shatter or dissolve, as one might expect of objects left so long beneath moving water. Porcelain, fired at the extraordinary temperatures the Chinese kilns had mastered centuries before, proves remarkably indifferent to submersion. It does not rust like iron. It does not rot like wood or cloth. It simply waits, its glazed surfaces protected from abrasion by the very silt that entombed them, its shapes and colors preserved in a kind of suspended perfection that stood in strange contrast to the slow darkening of the timbers around it. Where organic materials aboard the ship had once carried the ship's fragrances, the sandalwood, the pepper, the resins whose scent had perfumed her hold on the day she sank, the passage of centuries reduced these to traces, to residues detectable only through careful chemical analysis, the ghost of a smell that could no longer be smelled but could, remarkably, still be measured. And so the ship became, in the most literal sense, a stratified object, a layering of transformations occurring at different rates within the same enclosed space. Metal corroding here, wood darkening there, ceramic waiting in patient stillness somewhere else, all of it wrapped in a shroud of accumulating mud that thickened year upon year, until the vessel that had once ridden high and proud upon the surface of the bay became instead a low mound scarcely distinguishable, to any eye that might have looked from the natural contours of the seabed itself. Above the water, meanwhile, her name was disappearing. This is perhaps the strangest part of the long silence that followed the sinking, stranger in some ways than the physical transformation of the wreck itself. Ships of this era, however grand, were not always recorded with the meticulous permanence that later centuries would apply to vessels of significance. Manifests were kept on paper, and paper burns and floods and simply crumbles into illegibility after enough decades of humid southern Chinese air have worked upon it. Officials who might have known her name, who might have signed the documents authorizing her final voyage, lived their lives and died in the ordinary course of things, carrying whatever personal knowledge they possessed of her into their own graves. Families of the sailors who had walked her decks, who had perhaps stood upon the docks of Quanzhou watching her depart with private hopes for a safe return, waited for a time, as families of missing sailors have always waited, and then, when no return came, folded their grief into the ordinary business of continuing to live, and in time they too passed from memory, taking with them whatever oral traditions might have preserved some fragment of the ship's identity. There is something quietly devastating in this ordinary erasure, more so perhaps than if the ship's disappearance had been marked by some dramatic act of destruction that historians could point to and record. A ship that burns in a great battle is remembered because the battle is remembered. A ship that sinks in a storm witnessed by other vessels is remembered because survivors carry the story home. But a ship that simply does not arrive, that vanishes from a bay without witness and without drama, in a manner so quiet that no one aboard other vessels thought to note the date or circumstance, becomes a ship without a story, and a ship without a story is, in the long run, indistinguishable from a ship that never existed at all. This is the particular fate that seems to have befallen the vessel resting beneath Quanzhou Bay. No log survives to tell us her name. No official record names her captain. No merchant's ledger, discovered in some archive, lists her cargo by manifest number or records the day of her departure. She sank into an anonymity as complete, in its way, as the physical burial that the mud performed upon her timbers. It would be tempting to call this a tragedy, and in some sense it surely was, for whatever crew went down with her, whatever names might once have been spoken by grieving families in the streets of the old port, are lost now beyond any hope of recovery. But there is another way to regard this long silence, one that the passage of centuries seems almost to invite, which is to see in it not merely loss but a kind of patience, a demonstration of the sea's peculiar habit of keeping what it takes rather than releasing it, sealing it away not out of malice but out of the simple, indifferent thoroughness with which water and time perform their work together. The sea does not forget in the way a person forgets, through carelessness or the fading of memory. The sea simply holds, without particular intention, whatever falls within its reach, for as long as conditions allow, which, in the case of this vessel, proved to be a span longer than the lifespan of the dynasty that built her, longer than the empire that inherited her ruins, longer than the memory of any single family or lineage that might once have called her sailors their own. 700 years is long enough for a language to shift its pronunciation beyond recognition, for a coastline to redraw itself under the patient work of tides, for the very shape of the harbour she departed from to change so thoroughly that a sailor from her own era, transported forward, might not recognize the shoreline at all. It is long enough for the written records of an entire dynasty to be copied, recopied, damaged, and partially lost in the ordinary attritions of history, so that even the most diligent archivist working centuries later would search in vain for the particular entry that might have named her. And it is long enough, above all, for silence itself to become a kind of permanent condition, so settled and complete that when the first signs of her presence finally stirred beneath the mud of Quanzhou Bay, they would seem to emerge not from history at all, but from somewhere outside it, from a depth of time that ordinary records could not reach, waiting only for the sea, in its own unhurried way, to decide that the silence had lasted long enough. The year that the silence began to loosen was 1973, though no one who woke that spring in the villages around Quanzhou harbour understood yet that anything was about to change. The bay lay as it always had, a wide, shallow reach of brackish water threaded with tidal creeks, its mudflats exposed twice daily to the pale Fujian sun and then swallowed again by the patient rhythm of the tide. Fishermen worked the shallows in small wooden boats, much like their grandfathers had, hauling nets weighted with the same kind of care, watching the same herons stand motionless in the reeds. The harbour had long since ceased to be the great artery it once was. Silt had crept in over the centuries, narrowing the channels, softening the old anchorages into marsh. Where merchant ships from 100 kingdoms had once crowded the water so thickly that a person might have walked from hull to hull without wetting a foot, there was now only mud, grass, and the slow declining hush of a harbour that history had set aside. And yet the mud remembered. It always had. For generations, the people of the region had spoken in the unhurried way that coastal families speak of old things, of wood beneath the flats. Fishermen digging for clams sometimes struck something harder than clay, something with a grain and a weight that did not belong to the natural world of root and stone. Farmers reclaiming small plots of land near the tidal edges occasionally turned up blackened planks, heavy with the particular density that comes only from centuries of submersion, wood so saturated with mud and salt that it had turned nearly to stone itself. Such fragments were noted, discussed briefly over meals, and then returned to the earth or set aside as curiosities, because no one imagined they were anything more than scattered debris, the ordinary residue of a harbour that had seen ordinary losses over ordinary centuries. The old stories spoke vaguely of a great ship, a foreign trader, a wreck from the time when the Mongols ruled and the ocean roads were crowded with distant fleets. But stories in a fishing village travel the way silt travels, thinning as they spread, and by the middle of the 20th century what remained was only a murmur, a fragment of memory too faint to act upon. It was into this quiet, half-forgotten landscape that a handful of local historians and museum researchers began asking careful questions in the early months of 1973. Their interest was not born of sudden inspiration, but of years of patient work already underway in Quanzhou, where scholars had been assembling, slowly and without fanfare, a picture of the city's maritime past from the fragments that had survived above ground, inscriptions on old gravestones, entries in dynastic gazetteers, the faint traces of a foreign quarter once alive with the languages of Persia and Arabia and the Indian coast. These researchers understood, in the way that patient scholars often do, that the written record of Quanzhou's greatness told only part of the story, and that the physical evidence of its former life as a harbour of 1,000 ships might still lie beneath the very ground their informants walked upon each day. When word reached them of the old fishermen's tales, the hard wood in the clam beds, the blackened timber that farmers occasionally struck with their hoes near Huzhou, the researchers felt the particular quiet excitement that comes not from certainty, but from the possibility that a rumour long dismissed might, after all, contain a grain of truth. They began by listening. This is perhaps the least dramatic part of any archaeological discovery, and yet it is often the part upon which everything else depends. Teams of researchers visited the villages near the harbour, sitting with elderly fishermen in the shade of their houses, asking them to recall exactly where the wood had been found, how deep it had lain, what it had looked like when the mud first released it. Memory, especially the memory of old men recalling childhood encounters with strange timber in a clam bed, is an imprecise instrument, and the researchers knew this. But imprecise memory, when gathered patiently from enough sources and cross-checked against itself, has a way of converging on something real. Several accounts, independent of one another, pointed toward the same general stretch of mudflats southeast of the old anchorage, an area where the tidal creek widened before narrowing again toward the harbour mouth. It was not a precise location, it was, at best, a suggestion. A rough circle drawn on a map from the overlapping recollections of men who had spent their childhoods wading in that mud, without ever imagining they were walking above something the world would one day want to see. Still, a suggestion was enough to begin. In the late summer of that year, a small survey team returned to the area with the simplest of tools: iron probing rods, notebooks, and the patience required for work that offers no immediate reward. Probing for buried structures beneath tidal mud is not glamorous labor. It consists of walking a grid across the flats at low tide, driving a slender rod into the silt at regular intervals, and feeling through the resistance transmitted up the rod into the hand, whether the substance beneath is ordinary mud, buried stone, or something with the particular give and hardness of old wood. It is work best done slowly, without haste, because haste causes a surveyor to misread the difference between a buried root and a ship's timber, between an old fence post and the rib of a hull. The team worked the flats through the low water hours of several days, marking each point where the rod encountered resistance, gradually building a map not of certainty, but of possibility. A scatter of marked stakes across the mud that hinted faintly at a pattern. It was this pattern, subtle, uneven, but persistent along a particular alignment, that gave the researchers their first real reason for hope. The points of resistance did not scatter randomly across the flat, as one would expect from ordinary debris accumulated over centuries. They followed a rough line, curving gently, consistent in a way that mere driftwood or discarded planking rarely is. A trained eye, examining the pattern of stakes from a slight rise above the flat, could almost trace in it the ghost of a shape. Long, narrow, curved at one end, the suggestion of something that had once possessed a deliberate form. It was the kind of moment that experienced excavators learn to treat with both hope and caution in equal measure, because mudflats are notorious for offering false promises, and it would not have been the first time that a hopeful line of buried resistance turned out to be nothing more than a long-vanished seawall or the collapsed remains of an old dike. And so the team proceeded as archaeologists always must, testing hope against evidence, moving from probing rods to the first careful trenches. Small test pits were opened at intervals along the suspected alignment, dug by hand through layers of soft grey mud that gave way foot after foot, with a heaviness that seemed to increase the deeper the diggers went, as though the earth itself were reluctant to release what it had held so long. The work was slow and unglamorous in the way that all careful excavation is slow and unglamorous, requiring the diggers to remove the mud in thin, deliberate layers, watching constantly for any change in color or texture that might signal the presence of something worked by human hands rather than shaped by tide and time. For the first several days, the trenches yielded little more than the ordinary debris of a harbour long since silted over. Broken shards of coarse pottery, fragments of shell, the pale bones of small fish that had died in some forgotten century and settled undisturbed into the mud. Then, in one of the trenches nearer the center of the suspected alignment, a digger's trowel struck something that did not give the way mud gives. The sound was subtle, almost nothing, a faint scrape rather than a thud, but it was enough to still the hands of everyone nearby. The digger worked more carefully now, clearing the surrounding mud in small increments, until at last there emerged from the grey silt the unmistakable edge of a plank. Not driftwood, not a random fragment, but a length of timber with a clean worked surface, joined at one end to another plank in a manner that spoke unmistakably of construction, of intention, of a hand that had shaped it centuries before for a specific and deliberate purpose. The wood, when it was fully exposed, was black, not the black of decay, but the deep, dense black that comes from centuries of anaerobic submersion in oxygen-starved mud, a black that seemed almost to absorb the pale daylight of the flat rather than reflect it. It was heavy in a way that surprised those who lifted samples of it, waterlogged through and through, its cellular structure so saturated with moisture that it seemed less like wood than like some strange, dark stone shaped in the memory of wood. And yet beneath the blackness, when the surface was gently cleaned, the grain remained visible, along with the faint ghostly marks of tools, the scars of adzes and saws that had shaped this timber long before anyone standing in the trench that day had been born. Word of the find spread quickly, though carefully, through the small community of researchers overseeing the work, and then, with more caution, up through the regional cultural authorities who understood the significance such a discovery might hold. There was, in those early days after the first plank emerged, a quality of restrained excitement that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not stood at the edge of an uncertain excavation, watching a shape slowly assert itself against the doubt of centuries. No one yet dared to call it a shipwreck. No one yet knew its size, its age, its origin, or even whether it represented one vessel or the scattered remains of several. But as trench after trench was opened along the suspected alignment and plank after plank emerged from the mud in a pattern too consistent to be accidental, the outline of something large and deliberately built began, slowly and unmistakably, to take shape beneath the silt of Quanzhou harbour. The first faint suggestion, after 7 centuries of silence, that the sea was at last prepared to give something back. The work that followed was not the work of adventurers, but of patient men and women in cotton jackets, moving with the deliberate slowness that mud and water and old wood demand of anyone who wishes to preserve rather than merely uncover. By the early months of 1974, the site at Quanzhou harbour had drawn a small community of archaeologists, labourers, and local fishermen who had spent their lives reading the tides of that same bay and now found themselves reading something older still. The decision was made after careful study of the trenches already opened to attempt a full excavation of what lay beneath. Not a probing exploration, but a complete raising of whatever vessel rested there, however large it proved to be. This was no small undertaking in a harbour still governed by the rhythms of the sea. Water does not wait for scholars, and mud does not hold its shape once disturbed. To work at all, the team first had to hold back the very element that had preserved their discovery for 700 years. They began with earthen cofferdams, walls of packed clay and timber raised in a wide perimeter around the buried hull, built by hand under the direction of engineers who understood that the ship's survival now depended less on the sea than on the discipline of the excavation itself. Bamboo scaffolding rose along the margins of the pit. Pumps, modest by later standards, were set to draw the harbour water down inch by inch, and for days the workers watched the black water recede in slow, uneven sheets, exposing first a rim of grey silt, then a texture beneath it that no one present had seen at such scale before, the unmistakable geometry of shipbuilding, timber meeting timber in the long curved discipline of a hull. There was no rush to celebration. The team moved instead with the caution of people handling something that might crumble at the wrong touch. Centuries in anaerobic mud had preserved the wood remarkably, but exposure to air and light after so long a burial can undo in days what water spent lifetimes protecting. Every plank, once uncovered, was kept damp, shaded where possible, and photographed before a single tool touched it further. Accounts differ on who first said it aloud, remarked that they were not excavating a ship so much as attending to a body that had rested peacefully and did not wish to be woken carelessly. The phrase stayed with the team, repeated quietly among themselves in the weeks that followed, half in reverence, half in genuine caution. As the water fell further and the surrounding mud was cleared in careful layers, the true scale of the vessel began to declare itself, and it did so slowly, the way a coastline reveals itself to a ship approaching through fog. First a suggestion, then a certainty, then something larger than anyone had quite prepared for. The hull, when at last its full outline could be traced, measured more than 30 meters in length, with a beam close to 10 meters at its widest point. It was not the largest vessel ever imagined from the age of the maritime Silk Road, for texts had long spoken of ships larger still, but it was, in that spring of 1974, the largest and most complete hull of its kind ever recovered from Chinese waters, and among the most intact medieval seagoing vessels found anywhere in the world. The workers who had spent weeks clearing mud from what they assumed were isolated timber fragments now understood they had been tracing all along the ribs of something whole. What struck the archaeologists most in those early days of full exposure was not simply the size of the hull, but the survival of its internal structure. The bulkheads, those transverse walls of timber that divided the vessel's belly into separate watertight compartments, remained standing in startling number, more than a dozen of them, upright and largely undisturbed after 7 centuries beneath the silt. This was no small matter to those trained in the history of shipbuilding. Bulkhead construction, dividing a hull into sealed sections so that damage to one compartment would not doom the entire vessel, was a hallmark of Chinese maritime engineering, described in scattered historical accounts but rarely seen in such complete physical form. Here, preserved in wood rather than words, was proof made tangible. A vessel built not merely to sail, but to survive the sea's routine cruelties, compartment by compartment, precisely as the old accounts had claimed. Scholars who had spent careers reading textual descriptions of such construction now stood in the mud looking at the thing itself, and several would later admit in later writings and interviews that no amount of documentary study had prepared them for the quiet authority of standing inside a hull built this way, feeling with their own hands the thickness of the planking, the care of the joinery, the evidence of a shipbuilding tradition that had reached by the height of the Song dynasty a sophistication that much of the world would not match for centuries. It was not only the hull that spoke. As the excavation proceeded through the vessel's interior, cargo began to emerge from the surrounding mud in fragments that carried their own quiet eloquence. There were traces of spices, the kind whose scent had once perfumed the holds of countless ships along this route, pepper in particular, present in quantities substantial enough to suggest cargo rather than incidental presence, alongside fragments identified as frankincense and other aromatic resins whose origins lay far to the west, in the ports of the Arabian coast and beyond. Medicinal substances appeared as well, remnants of what had once been carefully stored materia medica, the kind of cargo that spoke not of luxury alone but of the practical exchange of knowledge and remedy that had long moved along these waters between civilizations that otherwise knew little of one another directly. Coins surfaced too, corroded but legible, bearing the marks of several different reigns and mints, evidence of a currency history that mapped as clearly as any chart the trading world this vessel had moved through. And among the most quietly moving of the finds were the wooden tags, small, unassuming slips of wood, inscribed with characters identifying merchants, destinations, quantities. These were not treasures in the sense that glitter or gold might suggest. They were paperwork, essentially, the mundane administrative residue of trade, and it was precisely this mundanity that gave them their power. Here were the names, however abbreviated, of people who had once stood on a dock in this same harbour, arranging for goods to be loaded, expecting their return, unaware that this voyage would be the vessel's last. The archaeologists who first lifted these tags from the mud, brushing away silt to reveal characters that had not been read by human eyes in 700 years, were said to have worked in near silence, the ordinary chatter of the excavation site quieting of its own accord in the presence of something so personal amid the vastness of the hull surrounding it. Every object, however small, was treated with the same unhurried care that had governed the raising of the timbers themselves. Photography accompanied each stage of the work, methodical and exhaustive, so that the exact position of every plank, every bulkhead, every scattered fragment of cargo could be recorded before anything was moved from where the centuries had left it. Detailed drawings were made alongside the photographs, sketched by hand in notebooks that would themselves become historical documents, preserving measurements and orientations that photography alone might not fully capture. Samples of wood were set aside for later analysis, their species and condition catalogued, while more fragile organic materials, the traces of spice, the remnants of rope, the degraded fragments of what might once have been textile or paper, were handled with a caution that bordered on the ceremonial, each placed into containers designed to slow, as much as anything could, the decay that exposure to open air had already set in motion. The preservation of the timbers themselves posed the greatest and most enduring challenge. Waterlogged wood that has spent centuries submerged is, paradoxically, at its most vulnerable the moment it is finally freed from the water that sustained it. Left to dry naturally, such timber will crack, warp, and disintegrate as the water within its cellular structure evaporates unevenly, undoing in weeks what the sea had protected for 700 years. The team understood this danger keenly, and much of the labor that followed the initial excavation was devoted not to further digging, but to the slow, painstaking work of keeping the recovered timbers damp, shielded from direct sun, and stable, buying time until proper conservation treatment could begin in earnest. Treatments that would, in the years following, involve the gradual replacement of water within the wood's structure with stabilizing compounds, a process measured not in days or weeks, but in years, a conservation effort every bit as patient as the excavation that had made it necessary. By the time the last timbers were lifted and the cofferdams allowed to yield once more to the harbour's ordinary tides, those who had worked the site understood they had done more than uncover an old boat. They had recovered a physical record of an age largely known otherwise through fragments of text and the occasional foreign chronicle, a document written not in ink but in timber and resin, in bulkhead and hold, in the quiet testimony of pepper dust and inscribed wooden tags. The mud that had held the vessel so long relinquished it at last, but reluctantly, and the archaeologists who stood over the emptied pit in those final days of the excavation were said to have felt, above all else, a kind of gratitude for what had survived, for what had been kept whole against every ordinary law of decay, and for the strange, quiet privilege of being the first in 7 centuries to stand where her crew once stood, and to look upon what the sea, at last, had chosen to give back. Once the hull lay open to the light of a century it had never known, the work of raising the ship gave way to a slower, quieter labour, that of reading her. Where the excavation had been a matter of mud and rope and patient hours beneath a Quanzhou sky, this new work belonged to laboratories and drafting tables, to calipers measuring the thickness of ancient planking, to the careful cross-sectioning of timber that had waited 700 years to speak. The ship, silent as she had been beneath the estuary floor, proved in this second unveiling to be almost eloquent. She had kept, within her bones, an account of a civilization's mastery over the sea, an account that scholars would spend decades transcribing, and that would, in time, alter the way the world understood the history of shipbuilding itself. The most striking of her secrets lay in her divisions. Where the hull might have been hollow from stem to stern, a single vulnerable chamber inviting ruin at the first breach, the builders of the Quanzhou ship had instead partitioned her body into more than a dozen separate compartments, each sealed from its neighbours by solid bulkheads of thick wood, corked and fitted with a precision that left little room for water to pass unbidden from one chamber to the next. It was not ornamental design. It was, the archaeologists came to understand, a technology of survival, a way of ensuring that should the sea find its way through the hull in one place, through the scrape of a reef or the slow work of a shipworm, the wound would be contained. Water might flood a single hold, might ruin a portion of cargo, might even list the vessel dangerously to one side, but it would not, in the ordinary course of misfortune, sink her. The ship could bleed without dying. This was not a minor refinement. It was, when properly understood, one of the most significant innovations in the history of maritime engineering, and one that Europe would not adopt in any systematic way for centuries to come. The bulkhead system that later became standard in ironclad vessels and ocean liners, the very design that would, ironically, prove insufficient to save a ship named Titanic when her compartments filled faster than intended, had its roots, in principle if not in direct lineage, in vessels like the one now lying in pieces on tables in Quanzhou, waiting to be measured and understood. A researcher who examined the hull in the years following its excavation put the matter plainly. This was, in her words, a solution to the oldest problem of the sea, how to keep a wooden world afloat when the water finds its way in, solved with a completeness that Western shipwrights would not achieve until the age of iron. She spoke without embellishment, in the manner of someone who had spent long hours with the evidence and trusted it to make its own case, but there was, in the quiet of her assessment, an unmistakable note of wonder. The compartments were not the only revelation. As the archaeologists worked their way through the layered timbers, they found what came to be called a V-shaped hull, a design that departed markedly from the flatter-bottomed rivercraft that had plied China's inland waterways for millennia. This deep, keeled profile was built for a different kind of water altogether, not the placid reaches of a river delta, but the open swell of the sea, where a vessel needed the capacity to cut against wind and current, to hold a course through weather that would have swamped a shallower design. The ship, in other words, had not been built merely to carry goods from harbour to harbour along a sheltered coast. She had been built to cross open water, to weather genuine ocean conditions, to make the long, exposed passages that connected China to the ports of Southeast Asia and beyond. This finding aligned with what the cargo itself had already suggested. The pepper, the frankincense, the ambergris, the woods that grew only in the tropical latitudes far to the south. But the hull's construction gave that suggestion a firmer, more technical grounding. Analysis of the wood species used in her timbers pointed toward materials sourced not only from Fujian's forests, but from more distant regions, some of them consistent with Southeast Asian origin, suggesting either that portions of the vessel had been repaired or refitted during voyages abroad, or that her builders had access to timber supplied through long-established trade networks, stretching well beyond China's own coastline. Either possibility spoke to the same underlying truth. This was a ship built by a civilization deeply, confidently engaged with the wider maritime world, not one merely dabbling at its edges. The rigging evidence told a similar story. Fragments of what had once been multiple masts, along with the remains of sail battens, the rigid ribs that stiffened Chinese sails into their distinctive fan-like shape, indicated a vessel capable of considerable speed and maneuverability, one that could be sailed efficiently by a smaller crew than her size might suggest, thanks to a sail design that distributed the labor of handling canvas more evenly than the great single sheets used on many Western ships of comparable age. It was an efficient system, refined over centuries of Chinese seafaring, and the Quanzhou ship carried its logic fully realized in her design. One historian, reflecting years later on the broader significance of these findings, offered an observation that seemed to gather the many separate details into a single coherent shape. "What we are looking at," he said, "is not a curiosity. It is evidence of a maritime tradition that had, by the height of the Song dynasty, reached a level of sophistication fully comparable to, and in certain respects exceeding, anything found elsewhere in the world at that time. The compartmentalized hull, the deep keel, the efficient rig, these were not lucky accidents. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations of shipwrights working within a state that actively supported maritime trade, that understood the sea not as a barrier, but as a road." He paused in the manner such scholars often do when the weight of an idea settles more heavily than expected, and added, "We spend so much time telling the story of European age of sail as though it were the whole of maritime history. This ship reminds us how much of that history happened first, and elsewhere, in waters we too rarely think to look." It was a fair correction, and one the Quanzhou ship, in her silent way, insisted upon simply by existing. The Song dynasty, during which she was built and sailed, had presided over what many historians now regard as a genuine golden age of Chinese maritime activity. A period in which the imperial government had relaxed older restrictions on private overseas trade, in which ports like Quanzhou had grown into some of the most cosmopolitan cities on Earth, and in which Chinese merchants, sailors, and shipbuilders had pushed steadily outward into waters that connected them to India, to the Arabian Peninsula, to the eastern coast of Africa. The compass, refined for maritime navigation during this period, had made such voyages more reliable. The junk itself, in its many regional variations, had become one of the most advanced vessel types afloat anywhere in the world. It was, by any honest measure, a period in which China stood not at the periphery of global maritime commerce, but near its very center. And yet, as every historian who studies this era eventually notes, often with a certain wistfulness, that golden age would not last in the form it took under the Song. The centuries that followed brought different priorities to the throne. The Ming dynasty, for all the spectacular scale of its own maritime ventures, the vast treasure fleets of Zheng He, dwarfing anything Europe would produce for another century, ultimately turned inward, curtailing overseas voyaging, restricting private trade, allowing the great fleets to be dismantled and their records, in some cases, deliberately destroyed. The reasons for this retreat remain debated. Concerns over cost, shifts in court politics, a reorientation of imperial attention toward internal stability and northern frontiers rather than distant seas. Whatever the cause, the effect was a slow withdrawal from the very waters the Quanzhou ship and her contemporaries had once sailed with such evident confidence. Seen against this larger arc, the ship recovered from the mud of Huzhou Bay becomes something more than a remarkable technical artifact. She becomes a kind of hinge in a longer story, evidence of a moment when China's engagement with the sea was expansive, outward-looking, deeply integrated into networks of exchange stretching from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean and beyond, a moment that would not, in quite the same form, come again. The compartments that kept her afloat, the keel that let her ride open water, the cargo of foreign resins and spices in her hold, all of it belonged to a China confident enough in its relationship with distant shores to build vessels capable of reaching them again and again, routinely, as a matter of ordinary commerce rather than singular expedition. The scholars who pored over her timbers in the years after her excavation understood this, and their published findings, careful and technical as they often were, carried beneath their surface a quiet sense of recovered inheritance, as though something the world had half forgotten about China's relationship to the sea had been, quite literally, dredged back into the light. The ship did not argue for this larger history. She simply embodied it, plank by plank, compartment by compartment, in the patient language of wood that had waited 7 centuries to be asked what it remembered. When the excavation teams had finished their careful documentation of the hull in its resting trench, the work that followed was, in its way, no less demanding than the raising itself had been. A ship that had spent 7 centuries submerged in the anaerobic mud of the harbour floor did not simply dry out and take its place upon a museum plinth. The timbers, saturated through and through with seawater, carried within their cellular structure a fragile equilibrium that the open air would have destroyed within weeks had nothing been done to intervene. Wood that has lain so long beneath water becomes, in effect, a kind of sponge holding its shape only because water fills every pore where solid fibre once stood. Remove that water too quickly, expose the beams to sun and dry wind as though they were ordinary salvaged lumber, and the timbers would have cracked, warped, and collapsed into fragments within a single season, undoing in a matter of weeks what the sea had preserved across 700 years. The conservators who took charge of the ship's second life understood this danger from the outset, and their response was to work with the same unhurried patience that had characterized every stage of the recovery before them. The timbers were kept saturated, first in tanks of fresh water meant to gradually displace the salt that seawater had driven deep into the wood's structure, a process that itself required months of careful monitoring, testing, and slow adjustment. Only once the salinity had been coaxed down to acceptable levels did the more delicate work begin. The introduction of consolidating agents, chemical treatments designed to occupy the spaces within the cell walls that water would otherwise leave empty as it withdrew so that the wood might dry without losing the structural integrity that had allowed it to survive at all. Solutions of polyethylene glycol, applied in careful, escalating concentrations over years rather than months, seeped into the timber's interior, replacing the departing moisture with a stable, wax-like substance that would hold the cellular architecture in place even after all the original water was gone. This was not swift work, and no one involved in it expected it to be. The treatment of a single vessel's full complement of timbers stretched across years, a slow negotiation between chemistry and history in which impatience could undo in an afternoon what caution had built across seasons. Reports from those years describe conservators checking moisture levels with the same quiet vigilance a physician might bring to a patient's recovery, adjusting humidity in controlled chambers, monitoring the wood for any sign of stress fracture or discoloration that might signal the treatment was proceeding too quickly for the material to bear. It was a discipline suited to the ship's own nature. She had waited 7 centuries already. A few more years of careful drying asked little of her that she had not already demonstrated an ability to endure. The building constructed to house her once this long stabilization was complete stood, and still stands, within the grounds of what would become the Quanzhou Maritime Museum, a structure designed from its foundations upward around the singular purpose of sheltering this one vessel and the story she carried. The hall built to receive her was not an afterthought appended to an existing collection, but a space conceived specifically for her dimensions, her fragility, and the particular atmospheric conditions her preserved timbers would require for the remainder of their existence. Humidity within the display hall is regulated with the same attentiveness that governed her drying, held within narrow tolerances that protect the treated wood from the swelling and shrinking, that ordinary seasonal changes in ambient moisture would otherwise inflict upon it. Light, too, is managed with care, kept low enough to prevent the slow bleaching and embrittlement that ultraviolet exposure brings to organic materials, so that visitors entering the hall pass from the bright subtropical daylight of Quanzhou's streets into a hushed, dim interior where the ship rests in a kind of perpetual twilight suited to her preservation. Within that controlled quiet, her surviving timbers have been reassembled according to the careful diagrams drawn up during excavation, each numbered plank returned as nearly as possible to the position it occupied when the hull still held its shape upon the harbour floor. The reconstruction does not pretend to completeness. Long stretches of the upper works were lost entirely to time and tide, and the museum has made no attempt to disguise this absence with invented timber standing in for what does not survive. Instead, the visitor encounters something more honest and, in its way, more moving. The lower hull, rebuilt from its actual bones, solid and unmistakably real, rising toward the place where the vessel's upper structure would once have continued and then simply stopping. The absence itself, a kind of testimony to everything the sea had taken, even as it preserved so much else. The bulkheads stand where they always stood, the watertight compartments still legible in cross-section, the mortise and tenon joinery that had confounded and then delighted the excavation teams visible now to any visitor willing to look closely at how one plank meets another without benefit of a single iron nail. Nearby, in exhibit rooms kept to the same hushed climate-controlled standard as the hull chamber itself, the cargo recovered from her holds has found its own second life on display. The peppercorns that once filled sacks in her compartments are shown now in small quantities behind glass, alongside fragments of the sappanwood that had darkened the harbour mud around them. The frankincense and other resins presented in cases that allow something of their scent, even after 7 centuries, to reach visitors who lean close enough. The coins are arranged in careful rows according to dynasty and mint, a numismatist's argument made visible, each piece a small fixed point in the larger uncertain map of the ship's final voyage. Ceramic sherds, ballast stones, fragments of rigging and tools sit in cases arranged not as isolated curiosities, but as pieces of a single continuous story, the museum's design guiding visitors from the vessel's construction through her working life and toward the disaster that ended it, all discovered together, all speaking to the same vanished afternoon when the harbour swallowed a fully laden trading ship. It is a strange kind of intimacy walking through those rooms. Visitors who arrive at the museum knowing little of the ship's history often describe an unexpected quiet settling over them as they move from the bright exhibits explaining the maritime Silk Road's broad historical sweep into the dim hall where the hull itself waits. There is a particular hush that seems to belong to spaces built around the honest remains of the past, rather than around replicas or reconstructions, and the Quanzhou ship's hall carries that hush especially heavily. People stand at the railings surrounding the hull for long minutes, tracing with their eyes the line where planking meets bulkhead, imagining, as visitors to such places inevitably do, the vessel not as she rests now, but as she once was, decks crowded with sailors going about the unglamorous business of a working voyage, sails catching a monsoon wind. She was built to read. Cargo holds packed tight with the fragrant wealth of half a dozen distant coastlines, all of it moving steadily toward a homecoming that never arrived. Teachers bring students to stand before her and explain, in whatever terms suit the age of their audience, that this was not myth or legend, but a real vessel that carried real people toward a real destination, that the peppercorns behind the glass nearby were meant for kitchens and merchants who never received them, that somewhere among the coins in their careful rows might have been wages meant for a sailor's family waiting in a Quanzhou household that watched the harbour mouth for a ship that would not come. Historians visiting from abroad have described standing before the hull with a particular kind of professional reverence, recognizing in her surviving timbers physical confirmation of trade routes and shipbuilding techniques they had previously known only through documentary fragments and second-hand report. For them, her second life as a museum exhibit is also a kind of ongoing argument, evidence still being read and reread as new questions arise and new comparative studies draw fresh conclusions from her preserved bones. And yet, for all that her recovery answered, she has kept certain silences that no amount of careful scholarship has yet managed to break. Her name is one such silence. No fragment of her recovered from the mud carried any mark or inscription identifying what she was called by the sailors who worked her, and no surviving document from the period has been matched with certainty to this particular hull. Museum placards refer to her simply as the Quanzhou ship, a designation of place and circumstance rather than of identity, and scholars who have searched port records and merchant correspondence from the era have found candidates and possibilities, but nothing that rises to the level of proof. She remains, in the most literal sense, nameless. A vessel whose makers and sailors surely called her something, in some now untraceable combination of characters, but whose actual name went down with her into the mud and has not yet been recovered from any surviving record. Her final voyage carries a similar uncertainty. The cargo tells scholars a great deal about where she had been and what she carried, but it cannot tell them, with the precision historians would prefer, exactly what circumstance brought her down in Quanzhou's own harbour rather than at open sea or along some more distant coastline. Was she returning home after a long voyage abroad, caught by storm or structural failure within sight of the very harbour she meant to reach, her crew perhaps able to see the shoreline even as the water rose around them, or had some other misfortune? An onboard fire, a collision, a slower and less dramatic failure of aging timbers brought her down before she had even properly begun the outward or homeward leg of a longer journey. The evidence permits several reconstructions and confirms none of them absolutely, and this uncertainty has become, itself, a subject of ongoing academic discussion, papers proposing one scenario or another, weighing the placement of cargo, the condition of the hull, the historical record of storms and disasters in the relevant years, without ever quite closing the question to universal satisfaction. It is, perhaps, fitting that a ship raised so painstakingly from centuries of silence should retain some portion of that silence even now, standing complete enough to move visitors to quiet reflection, but incomplete enough that her full story continues to invite question rather than closure. She rests in her humidity-controlled hall not as a solved mystery displayed for casual admiration, but as an ongoing conversation between the patient wood that survived and the historians who continue, gently and without urgency, to ask what more it might yet be persuaded to tell. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over a ship once her questions have been asked and only partially answered, a silence unlike the one that covered her for 700 years beneath the mud of Quanzhou harbour, and yet not entirely unlike it either. In both silences, she waits. In both silences, she keeps something back. The difference now is that she waits in the company of those who have learned to listen, who return to her again and again with new instruments, new questions, new humility about what a fragmented hull can and cannot say. She has passed from the keeping of the sea to the keeping of memory, and memory, it turns out, asks nearly as much patience as mud does. To stand before her now, in the hall built to hold her, is to stand before two ships at once. There is the vessel she was, broad-beamed, watertight bulkheaded, iron-nailed, laden with pepper and ambergris and the quiet fortunes of merchants whose names went down with whatever paper once recorded them. And there is the vessel she has become, a teacher without a voice, a text written in wood grain and nail pattern and the chemical signature of resin, requiring translators rather than readers. The first ship carried cargo across the South China Sea toward a home she never reached. The second carries something harder to load and harder to lose, the accumulated understanding of how a civilization built its reach into the world, plank by plank, bulkhead by bulkhead, decision by decision, each one made by hands now indistinguishable from the timber they shaped. It is worth sitting with this doubling because it says something true not only about the Quanzhou ship, but about every wreck ever raised from the sea's keeping. A vessel of ambition becomes, without any change to its physical substance, a vessel of instruction. Nothing is added to the wood. Nothing is subtracted, save what the centuries already took. And yet the meaning shifts entirely, the way a word can shift entirely when spoken in a different room. She was built to be forgotten in the ordinary way that all working ships are forgotten, worn out, broken up, replaced by newer hulls, remembered only in the ledgers of owners and the occasional letter of a captain complaining of her draft or praising her speed. She was not built to be remembered as a teacher. No shipwright shaping her bulkheads in some yard along the Fujian coast imagined that 7 centuries later, strangers speaking languages that did not yet exist would measure the spacing of his nails and draw conclusions about the technological confidence of his age. And yet this is precisely what happened. And it happened because she failed to complete her final voyage. Her ordinary fate, success, service, eventual retirement, and quiet dismantling was denied her by the sea, and in that denial, an extraordinary fate was granted instead. She sank, and in sinking, she was saved from the fate of every ship that succeeds, to be forgotten entirely, without residue, without lesson, without haul. There is a melancholy in this if one allows oneself to feel it, though it is a gentle melancholy rather than a bitter one. The ship did not choose to become a teacher. She would, if ships could choose, likely have chosen to complete her voyage, to unload her cargo at whatever port awaited her, to sail again and again until age or accident retired her honorably, her timbers repurposed into some later hull the way sailors have always repurposed sound wood, her memory persisting only in the practical continuity of use rather than the deliberate continuity of preservation. Instead, she was interrupted mid-purpose, her hold still full, her voyage still incomplete, and the interruption itself became the gift she did not ask to give. The sea, which took so much from her, her masts, her decking, her crew, her name, gave her this one thing in return, a kind of permanence that completed voyages never earn. Ships that arrive are used up, ships that sink sometimes are kept. This is the broader truth that the Quanzhou ship illustrates so patiently, and it is a truth that extends far beyond this single hull in this single hall in this single Chinese city. The sea remembers differently than the land does. On land, memory requires effort, the deliberate act of writing, building, naming, preserving. Absent that effort, land forgets quickly and thoroughly. Wood rots in open air within decades, buildings collapse, records burn or are lost to negligence, and the ordinary work of ordinary people vanishes almost as fast as the people themselves. But the sea, when it takes a ship into its keeping, sometimes preserves by a different mechanism entirely, not through anyone's intention, but through the accidental chemistry of oxygen deprivation, of silt settling in exactly the right proportions, of a hull driven into mud thick enough to seal it against the very forces of decay that would have destroyed it on any beach or in any harbour. The sea does not preserve out of tenderness. It has no tenderness to offer. It preserves out of indifference, which is strangely sometimes a more reliable guardian than care. A monument built with intention to endure often fails, worn by weather, damaged by neglect, torn down by changing tastes or shifting powers. A ship swallowed by mud with no intention at all sometimes endures precisely because no one was trying to make it endure, because it fell below the threshold of anyone's attention long enough for time to lose interest in destroying it. And so land forgets what effort fails to preserve, while the sea, on rare and unpredictable occasions, preserves what no one thought to protect. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of every recovered wreck, every ship raised from silence into the light of a museum hall. Discovery does not create the past. It restores it, recovers something that was never truly gone, only withdrawn from the reach of the living, waiting in the dark for the particular combination of tide and technology and human curiosity that would bring it back into a story capable of holding it. The Quanzhou ship was not lost in the way a memory is lost, fading gradually into nothing. She was set aside, held in trust by mud and water, waiting through dynasties and revolutions and the slow turning of centuries for the moment when someone would think to ask what lay beneath the harbour floor. The waiting was not empty. It was simply patient, in the way that the sea is patient with everything it takes, in the way that it will be patient with every ship yet to sink, every voyage yet to end mid-passage, every hull yet to become, someday, a teacher no one intended to create. It is fitting, then, to return once more to the bay itself, to Quanzhou Bay at the hour when the ship was first drawn upward into daylight in her broken pieces. Though we return to it now not for the drama of that recovery, but for the quiet that surrounds it on any ordinary morning, before and after, and entirely apart from the excavation that once disturbed its floor. Picture it now at dawn, the mist lifting slowly off water the color of old pewter, the harbour stirring with the small sounds of fishing boats setting out, their engines low, their wakes spreading in shallow arcs across a surface that gives no sign of what once rested and still, in fragments and echoes and absences, in some sense, continues to rest beneath it. The mud that held the ship for 7 centuries has not vanished simply because the ship itself was lifted from it. Somewhere in that same seabed, other fragments remain, too small or too scattered to recover, too thoroughly returned to the elements to reconstruct. Splinters of a mast, perhaps, or grains of pepper long since dissolved into the general chemistry of silt and salt, indistinguishable now from the mud that shares their color. The bay holds these remnants without ceremony, the way it holds everything, the way it has always held everything that sinks within reach of its tides. Waves move gently over that space now, as they moved before the ship was found, and will move long after everyone who studied her has joined her in whatever keeping time eventually offers. There is no marker on the water's surface, no monument visible from a passing boat, nothing to indicate that this particular stretch of harbour once held and briefly returned, and now merely remembers, a vessel that carried 7 centuries of Chinese maritime history folded into the practical shape of a working hull. The water does not know it was once a stage for such significance. It simply moves, the way water moves everywhere, indifferent to what it has covered and what it continues to conceal. And perhaps this indifference is itself a kind of lesson, gentler than any inscription could offer, that the sea does not perform meaning, does not announce its treasures, does not distinguish between the ordinary silt of its floor and the extraordinary history occasionally buried within it. It simply keeps. And it is left to us, standing on the shore or bending over an excavated hull in a climate-controlled hall, to supply the meaning that the water itself withholds. This has been the story of the Quanzhou ship, a vessel of ambition become a vessel of memory, raised not to complete the voyage the sea denied her, but to begin an entirely different one, slower, quieter, without destination. Carried forward now by every visitor who pauses before her weathered planks, and every scholar who returns with new questions to timber that has already answered so much and still, patiently, withholds a little more. If this quiet chronicle of a lost and recovered voyage has been good company for you tonight, you are welcome to seek out more lost voyages wherever this one found you, other ships and other silences waiting their turn to be remembered. There is no urgency in the invitation, only the same patience the sea itself seems to practice. The door left open gently for whenever you are ready to return.